Hello, welcome to Communication and Social Interaction, Communications 108. Today we're going to be talking about interpersonal communication. So let's start off by defining what is interpersonal communication. It is the process by which people exchange information, feelings, and meaning through verbal and nonverbal messages. So a message exchange is the verbal and nonverbal messages sent between two or more people. And again, you can have an actual verbal conversation or you can just have a heavy sigh. Meaning is what communicators create together through the use of verbal and nonverbal messages. And this takes two. It's like creating a dance between two people. And the meaning that a person is trying to create and the meaning that the person has created doesn't often match. So if you look over on the right hand side, you'll see the cartoon and the woman says, "Hey Ted, do the stripes make me look fat?" And her husband presumably says, "Not at all." And in his mind he's saying, "Fatter maybe." And again, what we are seeing here is he's not necessarily lying. He's just not giving the exclusive truth here. So why is interpersonal communication so important? Well, it increases your job success, it improves your relationships with family and friends, and it improves your academic performance. Ultimately, if you can't communicate well with other people, you really miss out on a lot of opportunities. So if you look at the cartoon here, you have someone who is at a job interview and he is asked clearly, "Yes, I think I have good people skills." What kind of idiot question is that? So again, you may think you have great people skills, but you really have to be honest in your assessment of those skill sets. The better we become at communicating with others, the closer we are to achieving what is called self-actualization. Self-actualization is a term coined by Abraham Maslow, and those of you who have studied psychology may have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is at the top, and you'll see his hierarchy over there on the right. It is the process of gaining information about ourselves in an effort to tap our full potential, spontaneity, and talents, cultivate our strengths, and eliminate our shortcomings. Ultimately, it's to be the best possible version of ourselves that we can be. And being a good communicator allows us to move in that direction. So when we look at communication, there are some competencies we need to achieve. A communication competency includes the ability to communicate with knowledge, skills, and thoughtfulness. Thoughtfulness is very important because ultimately you can be a great communicator, but if you're not kind, considerate, and thoughtful, your communication skills are not going to be as effective. The desire to humiliate or undermine a person is going to undermine your communication abilities. Additionally, being able to communicate in a civil manner, which is the acceptance of another person as an equal partner in achieving meaning during communication, is also extremely important. There's always a power dynamic in business. If you're talking to your boss, or if you're talking to somebody who works for you, if you're talking to a client, there is a person with power, the person who doesn't have the power. However, when you're communicating with someone, if you try to eliminate that power dynamic and treat that other person as equally as possible, that's going to improve the communication and ultimately improve the relationship with that person. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the models of communication. So we're going to start with the linear model of communication, which is characterized by a one-way process that transmits a message from a sender to a receiver through a channel. The sender is the source of a message. The message is either spoken, written, or unspoken information sent from a sender to a receiver. And the receiver is the intended target of a message. The channel is the pathway through which a message is sent, such as email, a telephone call, face-to-face, or a text message. This is a visual representation. We have our sender, our very important message sent through our channel, which looks like a 1974 telephone, and our receiver, and he looks a little deaf with his hand on his ear. Notice it is one way only. The one-way only issue is a big problem because noise impacts every message. Now, what is noise? Well, we all know that noise is something that is loud and obnoxious, but it's actually much more than that. Noise is anything that interferes with accurate transmission or reception of a message. So we're going to look at the types of noise. We have physical or external noise, and this is the noise that most of us think about when we hear the word noise. It is any stimuli outside of a sender or a receiver that interferes with the transmission or reception of a message, such as background music or someone talking behind you. So, for example, if you have kids, you know that as soon as you put the phone to your ear, they need to have a conversation with you. If you're in a club or a restaurant and you try and answer your phone, you know that the person you're talking to will have a hard time hearing you because they'll just hear all the noises behind you, and so on and so forth. Then we have physiological noise, and these are the biological influences on a sender or a receiver that interfere with the transmission or reception of a message, such as being hungry, being tired, having a headache or a cold, being distracted in any way. This is a picture down here of the word of the week, hangry, which is feeling or showing anger when one is extremely hungry, and a lot of us probably get like this. And if somebody wants to have a conversation with us when we are hangry, you know that they are not going to get very far because you need to feed the beast before you can be a person to have a civil conversation with. There is also what we call psychological or internal noise, and these include biases, prejudices, and feelings that interfere with the accurate transmission or reception of a message, such as stereotypes, biases, and assumptions. And, you know, it can be everything from not listening to someone of a particular religion or race because you're stereotyping them or biased against them, to being, you know, assuming that whatever your wife or husband has to say is the same old, so we don't listen to them, we tune them out. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't love our spouse, it just means we tend to tune them out after a while. The little picture on the right is a perfect example of this. The wife says, "You never listen to me, you only hear what you want to hear." And the husband says, "Sure, I'll have a beer." And I'm sure most of us have been in this situation. Another type of noise is semantic noise, and this occurs when senders and receivers apply different meanings to the same message. This specifically includes jargon, technical language, words and phrases that are familiar to the sender but are not understood by the receiver. So think about the last time you went to the doctor's office, or the last time you had a conversation about your computer and they're throwing all these terms at you and you just don't understand them. It's a different kind of vocabulary. And as such, there is not a good foundation for you to be able to discuss these words. A better option in terms of communicating with others is the two-way process in which a message is sent from sender to receiver and from receiver to sender using feedback. Ooh, we call this the interactional model of communication, and feedback is the key. These are the verbal or nonverbal responses to a message. So, internal feedback, this is when we give it to ourselves, when we examine our own communication. So, for example, let's say we give a presentation in class, and afterwards we think about how most of the people just kind of stared off into the distance, and you realize that you should have given way more examples. Alternatively, we have external feedback, and this is when people actually give us feedback. So, let's say that you do a presentation in class and you hand out a survey and you ask people to give you feedback. So you're closing the loop by asking people to comment on the information you provided. This is a much better option. Here is a visual representation of what the interactional model of communication looks like. We have all of our noise represented, and we have our sender, our message sent through a channel, our receiver, but we have that feedback loop coming through, and that feedback loop is the important piece of that information. So let's talk about some of the principles of interpersonal communication. First, it is unavoidable. We are always communicating either verbally or non-verbally. We cannot avoid it. Even if we're just sitting stone-faced watching TV, we are communicating non-verbally. We are saying to people, "Don't bother me, I am watching my show." It is irreversible. Our communication with others cannot be unsaid or reversed, even if we are apologizing. So some things just can't be unsaid. And, no matter how many times we apologize, it gets thrown in our face numerous times. It is also governed by rules, and these are prescribed guides that indicate what behavior is obligated, preferred, or prohibited in certain contexts. So, for example, when we're a little child, we learn to say please and thank you, especially when we're dealing in social situations. And this small rule expands into every facet of our life. So these rules become very, very important. Another principle of interpersonal communication is that it is learned, that skills evolve with age. So theoretically, the older we get, the better we are at communicating. Of course, this is not always the case, as we probably all know some older people who are terrible communicators, but they are unwilling to learn. Communication is also very symbolic, and it is also culture specific. So some symbols that are very well known in the United States may not be as well known in other countries. So for example, in the United States, when you raise your index and ring finger so it looks like a peace sign, this symbol in England may actually be telling someone to F off. The study of these symbols is called semiotics, and this study of these symbols studies why they evolved, how they formed, and where they came from. These symbols that communicate are very interesting, and when we look at these symbols in more detail, we kind of look at how they became so almost universal within our own culture. We also, in terms of the principles, must look at the content level. We have to look at the information and at what level it is in terms of the content. You know, you can't manage content at a level that is so far above you that it's written at a postgraduate engineering level for a kindergartner. Similarly, the relationship, the way you interact with someone that you're very good friends with is going to be much different than somebody you interact with who is a stranger. Another principle is our ability to make ethical choices. Ethics is our perceived rightness or wrongness of an action or behavior. So what are ethics? Being ethical implies having respect for others, shouldering responsibility, acting thoughtfully with others, and being honest. Aristotle's very famous quote is, "The point of ethics is to become good, not just to know what good is." So ultimately, following an ethical guideline will help you become a better person. When we make choices that we yearn to be ethical, we use what's called an ethical framework, and they've been created by very smart people over the years. And what we want to do is make sense of not just our world, but of our interpersonal relationships. Ethical behavior is essential when we communicate with people, especially when we don't see them and they don't share our physical space. The awareness of your decision and your decision making helps you make the right choices. So now we're going to talk about some of the ways or the frameworks that you can use to make good ethical decisions. The first one is called categorical imperative, and this suggests that one should act as an example to others. And this promotes the idea that individuals should follow a moral absolute. So for example, always tell the truth. So if your wife says, "Does my butt look big in these pants?" you should say the truth. "Yes, your butt does look big in those pants. Your butt always looks big." And then you sleep on the couch forever. This is based on the work of Immanuel Kant, and basically what he says is there are moral absolutes in this world, and it is our responsibility to always follow them. And if you think of things like do not kill, do not steal, do not cheat on your wife, do not lie, these are the moral absolutes. Then there is utilitarianism. What that means is what is ethical will bring the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And this was developed by John Stuart Mill. It promotes the idea that consequences for the most number of people is the most important. So if you have somebody who, if we do this thing, it'll save one person. And if we don't do this thing, it'll save 100 people. Well, we want to save 100 people. That's basically what it comes down to, is almost this democratization of ethics. Then we have the golden mean, which is a person's moral virtue stands between two vices, with the middle being the foundation for rational society. In other words, compromise is the benchmark. You have to give a little on both sides, you meet in the middle, and that is the right choice. It was initially articulated by Aristotle and adapted by Buddha, and this idea is that nobody wins, nobody loses, but everybody gets something. Then there's the idea of ethic of care, and this is concerned with the connections among people and the moral consequences of decisions. In other words, is this action free and fair of discrimination or favoritism? In other words, is this decision prejudicial? Is it free of discrimination? Another system is called the professional ethic. How would this action be judged by an impartial jury of your professional peers? So if you took an action, what would people in your same job say about the action you took? Then there's the publicity test. Would you be comfortable having the public learn about your behavior in the news? So let's say that you did something that was a little bit illegal to help someone out, but ultimately the good far outweighed the bad. So when it hit the news, people said, well, okay, it was a little illegal, but she saved someone's life. People would say, okay, maybe it wasn't the best way of handling it, but she saved the kid's life. People are still going to say, she's a good person. Then there's the virtue approach. Does this action promote the development of character in me and in my community? In other words, am I a role model? Have I contributed to the well-being of society? In other words, let's not worry about laws or rules or socially constructed norms. Have I done the right thing at the right time for the right people? Then there is significant choice, and this underscores the belief that communication is ethical to the extent that it maximizes our ability to exercise free choice or free will. Conceptualized by Thomas Nelson, and it promotes the idea that information should be given to others in non-coercive ways so that people can make free and informed decisions. So, as long as information is provided to you without any coercion or trying to persuade you or trying to convince you of something, so you have to get rid of every television commercial, every political ad, then you can make an ethical choice. This particular little cartoon on the bottom is an example of coercive information. If she complains about me giving her ultimatums one more time, it's over. As soon as an ultimatum is offered, that is, of course, a non-free choice. Another option or another issue in communication is called field of experience. And this is the influence of a person's culture, past experiences, personal history, and heredity on the communication process. Everyone has their own individualized filter from which they interpret the messages being sent and received. So, if you grew up on a farm and you had your mom and dad, but you also had your grandma living with you, and you had your own pony, and you went to school where there were only 12 kids in the entire school, and in the wintertime it was so bad, the weather was so bad that you didn't get a chance to go to school for weeks at a time. You know, this is going to create a filter for you to see the world, which is going to be much different than if you grew up in the city and you grew up without a dad or a mom and you didn't know your grandparents and your family didn't have a vehicle. So there's going to be a huge difference in how you see the world. A shared field of experience are the commonalities that bind people together, such as being from the same family, working at the same company, being part of the same team. So you can have two people who couldn't be more different, but if they work at the same company or they're on the same football team, they're going to have at least one shared field of experience. So when we talk about human interactions, we have to understand that not all communication is interpersonal. We also have impersonal communication. Impersonal communication is defined as a type of communication or interaction that is based specifically on social roles, such as communication between a sales representative and a potential customer. The manner of communication is informal and superficial, covering topics necessary to instigate a sale or a similar transaction. So, the next time you go out to buy a car, you walk up to the dealership and the salesperson is like, "Hey, how you feeling today? Beautiful weather. What do you feel like today?" They are super friendly, not because they want to be your friend, but because they want the commission that comes with you buying a car for them. The following factors determine the extent to which communication is impersonal or interpersonal. The relationship history. Prior relationship experiences that two people share. So, for example, a lot of women will have someone who has cut their hair for 10, 15, 20 years. And it may have started as an impersonal relationship, but because they have been seeing each other every 3 months for 10 years, they now have a history. Relationship rules. These are the negotiable rules that indicate what two relational partners expect and allow when they talk to each other. So the rules that exist between a boss and an employee, no matter how many years they work together, are going to be a lot different than the rules that exist between you and your best friend. Relationship uniqueness. And this is the ways in which the particular relationship of two partner stands apart from other relationships they experience. One of the most unique relationships is that of siblings. So, those of us with a sibling of the opposite gender, so a brother, in my example, we probably have tried to kill each other numerous times. And it really wasn't out of malice as much as sport. And as such, that's a pretty unique relationship. Whereas I probably have not tried to kill any of my friends, but a sibling relationship is going to be much different than a friendship or a romantic relationship. Context means the circumstances in which the message is sent. The types of context include the physical context. This is a tangible environment in which communication occurs. Are you face to face? Are you on the phone? Are you on different continents? There is the cultural context, and this refers to the rules, the roles, the norms, and patterns of communication that are unique to a particular culture. So if you are born in the United States, you are a true American, but your grandma comes from Puerto Rico and she is hardcore, old-fashioned, goes to church every day, does all of the old-fashioned stuff, wants you to get married before you leave home, the way you communicate with her is going to be much different than the way you communicate with your friends that are of your age and your culture. Then there's the socio-emotional context, which is the relational and emotional environment in which communication occurs. If you've had a fight with your love muffin, the way you communicate is going to be a lot different than if things are just regular old day. Then there's the historical context. Messages are understood in relationship to previously sent messages. So if you're having a conversation with your best friend about something that happened 10 years ago, you have a shorthand, whereas something that you discuss with someone that's relatively recent, who you don't know as well, is going to require a lot more explanation. Finally, and one can't discuss principles of communication without really addressing the fact that most of us are very apprehensive about communication. The bottom line is we all feel a little anxiety when we interact with people, especially people we don't know. But that's normal. And part of getting better at communicating with people is understanding that most of us have some anxiety, especially speaking in public. And when we interact with people from a different culture, we also feel anxiety because we don't know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So we're going to be talking about a lot of these items in class as well as during these PowerPoint presentations. So don't worry, we're going to be addressing these items. So if you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me, and I hope you have a terrific day. Thank you.